Hello and welcome to Rays of Hope, brought to you by the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center. I'm your host for today, Mary Foley, and I'm so glad that you've joined us. Today's topic is on victim advocacy, and I'd like to introduce our guest, Detective Nathan Young from the Paducah Police Department and LeAnne Garland from the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center. She serves as our victim advocate. Welcome to both of you. I'm glad you're here. We have a very important topic to discuss today, and I would like us to take a moment just to get to know both of you before we actually get into the topic. So let's start with you, Detective Young. Tell us about yourself and how long you've been with the Paducah Police Department.
Detective Nathan Young. I've been there approximately 8 years. I've worked in drug enforcement for 3 years and now in criminal investigations for the last 4 years.
Okay. Well, welcome. We're glad to have you today. LeAnne, tell us how long you've been with the center and what you do.
I'm the victim advocate, and I've been there 3.5 years, going on 4.
And so what does advocacy look like in terms of your job, your day-to-day activities with clients?
As advocate, I do several different things. I go to hospital calls with victims, go to the police department with victims whenever they get to that point, and then I also go through the entire court process with them. Any court hearing they have coming up, I go to that, explain the court proceedings to them.
So I guess that's how you all partner together. If you see this gentleman often, I'm sure, unfortunately, in terms of just the fact that there's a need for advocacy, but it's a great need. The Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center, I'll start with you, Detective, served 981 new victims of sexual crime last year. We served a total roughly over 3,000 victims for the fiscal year in some capacity, whether through the crisis line or through advocacy. So obviously that tells me, as the director of the center, that sexual abuse, sexual assault is certainly a problem in the Purchase area. The state of Kentucky served over 5,000 victims. So I guess from our perspective, we see sexual crime and we see the effects of it every day, as I'm sure you do as well. What does the scope of the problem look like for the McCracken County community from your perspective?
It has risen. A lot of the ones that we've run into, we usually has, for us, a lot of ones that I see usually has to do with either intoxication or drugs. Usually someone, a man or a woman, may go out, become intoxicated, and actually run into doing things that they normally wouldn't do, and then either be by memory loss or different things, and they regret what happens, and they report it. A lot of the problem is that they don't report it in enough time. They think about it for several days. A lot of the evidence that we collect is time-sensitive evidence. It needs to be done within, best case scenario is as soon as it happens. At the worst case, usually within 24 to 48 hours is when it definitely needs to be done. You're risking a chance of losing the evidence even at that time. So it's very crucial that as soon as that incident happens, it needs to be reported so we are able to collect the evidence that we need.
So you see a lot of the drug-facilitated, alcohol-facilitated sexual abuse and sexual assault situations. And from your perspective, what is the age group most vulnerable to that situation? Or is there a specific age group?
I don't think there really is a specific age group. Of course, you don't usually have too many 8-year-olds or anything going out and become intoxicated, but nowadays, I mean, it can be 14, 15, 16-year-olds even, all the way up. I've had 40-year-olds that went to a bar and had drank, and things happened that they didn't want to happen.
And LeAnne, in your day-to-day work, I'm sure you hear that often, the drug-facilitated part of this process. And so he's saying that there's a problem with people coming forward to report in a timely fashion. What would be some reasons for that you know of?
Well, there's many different reasons. One reason is they've been out drinking or they've been involved in something that they don't want to report to the police. Sometimes it is, it's happened, they're in shock that it's happened, so they don't want to immediately report, or they don't even think about, wait a second, I can report this. So there's many different factors. They're embarrassed, don't know what's going to happen when they do report, or even who to report it to. So there's many different aspects of why people don't come forward.
And so, since the evidence is time sensitive, what are some basic things that people need to be aware of that they don't need to do should they want to report to law enforcement?
Well, one, of course, like I said, they need to report it as soon as possible. They don't need to wash their clothes. They don't need to take a shower themselves. They need to try to stay exactly as they were when the incident happened.
Okay.
A lot of women, or and men, they may feel embarrassed, and like she said, and they want to clean themselves, because they felt like what happened was dirty and disgusting and things like that. And that's the worst thing you can do, because all you are is washing off every bit of evidence that we need to collect.
I see. So you brought up an interesting point that, yes, there's all of these psychological factors of embarrassment, shame, and emotional factors that would go into not wanting to report. But you also said that they may not be aware of what will happen when they do. And I think that's a huge unknown, and it's an obstacle. Is it an obstacle that you run into?
Oh, yeah. That which is where I kind of come into play when we work together is whenever we get a call or we show up at the hospital with a victim, we're going to explain what law enforcement needs from them and why they need it. And a lot of people don't realize that. That's why you do get a lot of people taking the shower and brushing their teeth or waiting before they come forward, because they don't realize that evidence is still there. So that makes it harder in the long run for them to have any kind of case whenever they come into the picture. So a lot of times they don't know what questions to ask or who the police department is, or they may have not had any reason to run into the police department.
And can you talk to the viewer, either the victim that may be watching or the family member of a victim or the friend of a victim? What should they expect when they come? Is it going to be terrible? Is it going to be comfortable? Give me an idea of what a victim expects if they come to report something like this.
Of course, whenever something like that does happen, we try to contact the Rape Crisis Center as soon as it does happen, have one of them come out to help them, be with them, and explain everything we're going to do. A lot of times, usually what happens if it is right after the incident, they'll go to the hospital. There, a sexual assault nurse or a doctor will perform a sexual assault kit. Basically, that kit does different types of swabbing. They draw blood. They take different types of hair follicles.
So I want to just interrupt right there, because I'd like to talk about each of these points.
Okay.
So we have the forensic rape exam, or the rape kit that's going to transpire. It sounds like an invasive exam. Is that the?
It is. It's not a comfortable exam. However, it's very crucial that we have the sexual assault kit done to be able to obtain possible DNA, sperm fluid, any type of fluids that could be there that potentially links it to a suspect.
I see. And so what steps do you as an advocate take to ensure that is as comfortable as a process as possible?
I make sure they're comfortable. I make sure that they have, what they need. Of course, they can't have anything to drink until the exam's over. A lot of times they'll just be nervous about what's happening. I've held hands many times, just, having blood drawn, or just needing somebody there who's not a family member or something like that, where they're uncomfortable or embarrassed. So a lot of times at that point, I'm just explaining what's happening and why it's happening. Another thing they do when they do that kit is they test for any type of STDs and that type of thing, and treat them, give them medication to prevent any STDs from the assault.
So it sounds like, in addition to there being a legal issue or something that you would need for a case, there's also a health, insulator there to make sure that they're checked and that they're treated if that should be the case and something that they should need. Right. So you're there to sort of educate them on that information. So they come to the hospital, they decide that they would like to go through this process. Is that something they can decide on their own, or is that something that is mandatory?
The kit to be done. Usually if they decide to press charges, the kit's the next step. As long as it's within that time frame, I think it's 72 hours.
I think 72 hours is the time frame.
And if it's past that, they don't usually do the whole kit. They'll probably do bits of it to check for the STDs and that type of thing. But they won't do the full exam because there's not going to be anything there. If they choose not to contact law enforcement, but they want to be checked out to make sure they're okay, they don't necessarily do the kit.
I see.
The kit is their evidence, so there's a chain of custody that has to start at that hospital, so there's no point for them to do the exam if they don't report.
And the kit's not mandatory. I can't, if a victim comes in, I can't force her to do the kit. That's up to her. However, if she refuses the kit, you're taking our chances of locating anyone, or even if she does know who the person is of proving that it even did happen.
Sure. So they go through the kit first. What happens next?
Usually once the kit is done, if they do know who a suspect is, then usually we will bring them in, interview them, and actually do usually we'll do either a search warrant or we'll ask them for consent to do a kit basically on them.
I see.
And try to collect that evidence. If they refuse, we'll either issue a search warrant for that kit. And if we do not know a suspect, then of course we'll try to do a composite with the victim, see if they'll develop a composite that we can put out to the media, saying if anybody recognizes is a person. And after that, we will usually we will send all the kits to the lab, have them run it through their CODA system, basically check to see if it's anyone that's been in the CODA system before, and see if we pull up a suspect that way. If we have a suspect, then we will have that compared to each other to make sure that that is the person that it was that did anything.
Okay. And so, I think that a natural concern or a fear from just a community member, let's just set up the scenario. We have an individual who maybe has not had reason, like you said, to encounter the police, and so they're victimized first, and then we go through a evasive exam. I would think that people may be hesitant about what kinds of questions are they going to be asked. Are they going to be blamed? How is that going to be approached? And how is that going to be dealt with? What would be your synopsis of what that looks like when the interview process begins for the victim?
Well, you say exactly, they are the victim. They're the one they're reporting it. So, we'll be there. We're the neutral side. We're there to gather the facts. That's basically all we're there to do. There's questions we're going to ask. We're going to ask detailed questions. And it is uncomfortable, but it's a procedure that has to be done. I need to know every single detail of what happened. Something that you may think is non-important to me may be very important. So we try to walk them through it. Usually, like I said, the advocate's usually there, and they understand why we have to ask the questions. I usually prepare them before we start asking questions. They're going to ask you questions. You need to be honest. You need to tell exactly what happened. After that, then that's when we'll try to do the composite. If there is a composite that they can see sometimes, if they wear a mask, then obviously a composite's not going to be worthwhile.
Right.
Or if they attack them from behind, they may not ever see anyone. So
it would be common for them not to know maybe some of the answers to some of the questions that you all will ask.
Yes.
And that's normal. And so, LeAnne, from your perspective, you're partnering with law enforcement, but you have a very different role. They're there to gather the facts. What are you there to do?
I'm there to offer them support. I'm there to help them understand that the questions that they're being asked are not blaming questions. A lot of times one of the things they'll say are, what were you wearing? What were you doing? Why were you there? And those kinds of things, which to a victim may be like, oh my gosh, he doesn't believe me. But it's not. And, they have a very specific job to do, and questions that they have to ask are not going to be comfortable for a victim. No matter what you're down there for, those questions aren't going to be comfortable.
Sure.
So I explain that to them, and then, encourage them to keep up, to be honest. About everything. I know sometimes that's a problem that we've encountered, where they leave things out because they don't want to be in trouble for them. But if we can tell them to be upfront and honest from the very beginning, it makes everything much smoother for the case.
And I think for the purpose of today's show, I think it's important to reiterate what you said, that they are the victim, and whether or not they made the wisest choice or the safest choice is really not up for anyone to judge. It just is a fact. It is what it is, and you just need that information so you can keep them safe and keep other members of the community safe.
Right.
We find that when we educate people about sexual violence, that people are shocked by the statistic that 80% of victims know their attacker. How does that statistic play out in your line of work? Does it seem to be comparable? Do most people know who attacked them?
Yes. A lot of times it's either a friend, someone they've dated before, or they at least know them. It might have been just that night they knew them, but they knew them enough. I haven't worked a whole lot of whodunits, where they didn't know exactly who it was or didn't have an idea who it was. Usually, like I said, we deal with mostly a lot of intoxication and drug ones. So usually they're dealing with people that they know they've been drinking with during the night or had been partying with somewhere or something like that.
So would you say that it is more of a, I guess, a myth or a TV Hollywood thing that it's this random person in the alley? I mean, I know it happens, but...
It happens. I mean, sure. Would it be 80%? I don't know the exact numbers, so I mean, I couldn't say, but it seems to be more that they know who did it rather than the ones who they don't know.
Okay. And then, LeAnne, from dealing with a client from a therapeutic perspective and from an advocacy perspective, how does that affect them differently, the fact that they would know this individual?
I've noticed that when the closer the relationship is that the victim has with the perpetrator, the longer it takes them to make that report. If it's someone, if it's a stranger and they have no idea who it is, and they were, kind of doing their own thing, minding their own business, they're more likely to immediately report that to the police. If they've been out, they've been drinking or whatever, they'll report, but it may take a little bit longer. If it's someone they have been dating or someone that they dated previously or whatever, it takes them a little bit longer because of all the emotional effects it has on them. They trusted that person. It may not be something they ever expected to happen, and just hard for them to believe, so it takes them a little bit longer to report that to police if they ever do.
So it seems to me that, right there is a significant problem. You're saying that the report needs to be almost immediate, and it needs to be, at the worst case scenario, within 72 hours, and you would prefer that it be within 24. But yet the statistics tell us that 80% of people know who attacked them, which makes them less likely to come forward. So both of you, as experts in this field, what would you say are ways to overcome that obstacle in terms of reporting, even though you know the person who has violated you? And you can choose which one wants to go first.
I think one of the main things is just education about sexual assault in general. Awareness that there is somebody out there to help them guide through the process. Law enforcement is understanding of what they're going through, and not only are they understanding, but they get people involved that can specifically help them. That way they can do their job. That makes it a little bit easier. It's hard for victims who know their attacker for them to come forward, because they're battling their own questions of, well, why did I let this happen, or why didn't I do this, and all of that. So it's hard for them to come forward. Just awareness that the resources are out there, and for them to be able to use it, I think would make it easier for them to come forward.
And that it's common, that they're not alone, that it's a common thing. Would you add anything to what she says?
Well, we're not there to belittle someone. We're there, like I said, to gather the facts. And that means we're going to have to ask things that are uncomfortable. We're going to have to do things that's uncomfortable. However, I would rather a victim come in as soon as it happened, have the kit done, have everything available. If they decide later that they didn't want to go through the process or go through the court proceedings, or they change their mind, I'd rather them do it later than to report it a month later and not have anything to show for it. I mean, it's basically she said versus he said, and that's what we run into a lot.
Well, and I think you bring up a very good point that people do have the option to go ahead and collect the evidence and then not go through the process. Is there ever a time when people don't have that option? Once that ball rolls, is there ever a time when you can't stop that?
Well, we have the option, even though the victim doesn't want to proceed after we collect everything and we can prove that it happened, we have the option to go ahead and prosecute without her consent.
Okay.
We try not to do that. It's up to the Commonwealth attorneys whether, based on the victim does not want to cooperate anymore, whether the Commonwealth will continue on with the prosecution or they will decline the prosecution.
Okay. And so I guess my next point I'd like for us to begin to talk about, in addition to, I want to get back to the services of the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center so people know how to access that advocacy part, and I want you to talk about, how to come in and make a report with you. But what I would like for you all to talk to us about is, it seems like you can agree with us that the problem is growing, that it is a significant problem across the state and of course in our county as well. And one of the best ways to begin to decrease this problem is to get the perpetrator off the street. And so we've identified lots of, I guess, reasons why people may not come forward. I guess my question to both of you would be, what could you say today, or what could you offer today that maybe would allow people at least that initial comfort of maybe I can do this? What's the best step? What's the first step if someone just needs more information about how to report or to how to make this decision?
Well, the first thing they can do is they can call our 800 number and then get the information on what to do next. I've known a lot of victims who, once they're a little unsure whether they want to report it or not, one thing that helps them is that if they report it and everything is done, that prevents it happening to somebody else, or it's going to be less likely that it's going to be able to happen to somebody else. So that is one thing that can help victims to really stick with the process, because it does get hard even after law enforcement gets their part done. Once it gets into the court proceedings, it's even harder.
And why is it harder?
Because the victim sometimes isn't aware of why things are happening. The court system is set up not very victim friendly. Meaning there's certain things set up to protect the perpetrator's rights. So it's not always the best process for them, and it's very hard, especially when they get to the point of going to court or going to trial, and they have to testify. It can be very hard on the victim to do that because a police officer is neutral in the situation, but a defense attorney's not. And they ask questions that are a little bit harder than the detective would ask. So it's not an easy process at that point. But going through all that prevents someone else to have to go through that.
And so what kinds of things do you do to make that process easier?
I explain it to them. I remind them that they've made it this far and that it took a lot to even survive the attack. It took a lot to go through that and tell somebody about it. Nobody wants to talk about personal things in public, and they've already done that. So they've taken the initial hard steps, and it's part of their recovery to be able to face that attacker and be able to, say that even though you've done all this, I'm still okay and I'm going to be okay. And that's part of it.
So that's part of, I guess, worth the journey.
Right.
You've described, I think, even today, some of the reactions that victims will have when that process is very difficult. But at the end of the process, how is the victim, now a survivor, how are they different than when they started from your perspective?
They're completely different. When they come in at that first time I see them at the hospital or at the police department, they're scared, they're unsure of what's going on. They're at probably their lowest point, if not pretty close to their lowest point that they'll ever be at. Once they've made it all the way through and they go and they face their attacker in court, they're allowed to have a victim impact statement, meaning when they get to court, they can tell that perpetrator exactly how this crime has affected them in open court. So everybody that's there will hear. It's very empowering for that victim. It gives them their control back. It gives them their purpose back. I mean, they are no longer the victim at that point.
They're the survivor. And so I'm assuming, Detective, that once you begin this journey with a client, and when a victim does come in and does report to you, how are they different from your perspective? If they choose to go through this difficult process, what does it do for them as you see it?
I think it makes them a stronger person once they finally get through it in an area, because it is very difficult. I try to explain that to them, because a lot of times we start asking detailed questions from the beginning. They get frustrated because we are asking them, because either they're embarrassed or I'm asking a lot of intruding questions. And I try to explain to them that when we do go through the court proceeding, it will be, I don't want to say worse, but it will be more involved, and they will, because they're trying to, of course, defense attorneys trying to get their client from guilty. So I have to ask those questions, and a lot of them I ask will be the same ones that a defense attorney will ask. So I'm trying to, in the same way, I'm preparing them as we go, because I'm asking them the same intriguing questions that a defense attorney will ask. Because you'd be surprised what happens when you get into a trial, and if I was the real nice guy and just, I don't want to ask that question, and then get there on trial and they start asking those questions to the victim, she don't know what to do, or he don't know what to do, and they react differently. But if they're prepared for those questions, then they know they're coming, they know how to answer those questions and not seem awkward or manipulative.
I see. So the first step you say that somebody can do in terms of the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center is call the 800 number, which we will give that number at the end of the program. They can speak with you. They do not have to be receiving any other service from
Right.
our center, correct?
Right.
Just advocacy if that's what they want. And you would be able to explain more in depth or to answer their questions for them. What do they do if they bypassed our center and they go to you?
They could call our dispatch, and if they wanted for us to come to her house and make a report,
Okay.
they could come to the Paducah Police Department and make a report. Depending on how long it had been since the incident happened, then will be determined on what steps we would take. Obviously, like I said, if it was within 72 hours, we'd call them and we'd ask them to do the sexual assault kit. Of course, if it was after 72 hours, then we would take the report. Patrolman would probably take a report, and it would be passed back to detectives, and then we would work from there.
Okay.
The key ingredient in all of it is as soon as it happens, is the best thing to do.
Okay. We have very little time left. I want to give you each about 15 seconds just to speak to the viewer about this crime, and what would you say to them if they're on the fence about whether or not to report, LeAnne?
I think if they're deciding whether to go for it or not, that it's definitely well worth it. I mean, they're not bad guys at the police department, and I think that sometimes that's the image, and they're there to help you as well. So just go ahead to make that call.
Okay. And you, what would you say?
I'd say the sooner the better. When the incident happens, report it. Let us get ahead of the game before. Don't report it a month later and we'd be so far behind and trying to play catch up, because it's very hard to prove once that happens.
Okay, well, I would like to thank you both for being here. Thank you both for your partnership for this community. Detective Young, LeAnne Garland from the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center, thank you for joining us. And thank you for joining us for another edition of Rays of Hope. Our phone numbers are going to be on the screen for you. Should you need some more information about this topic, you can call the Purchase Area Sexual Assault Center at 1-800-928-7273 or locally at 534-4422. We'd be happy to answer any of your questions and to provide you service as you begin your journey to recovery. We'll see you next time.